Hello everybody, I'm Ben Graham. This is our course on international political economy, and today we're doing the second part of our lecture on trade barriers. So we've talked about these three main tools of trade protection: tariffs and quotas and subsidies. And we've sort of talked about who wins and who loses. But right now I want to map them onto supply and demand graphs, right? So we started this course with supply and demand, we've moved into comparative advantage, and now we're talking about when governments step in and restrict trade, restrict free exchange. So we want to use the supply and demand material we have with these new, with this new trade barrier information. So I'm starting out here with a supply and demand example where you'll see that the domestic supply and the domestic demand cross such that the equilibrium price is sitting here at P0 and the equilibrium quantity is at Q0. And the way to understand that is that if there's no trade, right? So if the country in our example is not trading with anybody else, then this is what the equilibrium price and quantity in the market will be. But now we imagine a world where this country opens up to free trade and they can trade as much as they want at the world price, right? And we're representing the world price here with a flat line, the world supply, because we're saying relative to the size of this little country we're modeling, the world economy is so large that for all intents and purposes, this country can buy or sell as much as it wants at the world price without moving that price, right? In truth, right, there's actually a little bit of a slope to this line, but we've simplified this toy model and kept it totally flat. So what you see is that the world price is actually pretty high here. It's higher than the domestic equilibrium price. So when we open up to free trade, suddenly the price of this product is going to rise, right? And so if you're a supplier in the domestic economy, you're like, whoa, this higher price is awesome. I'm going to produce even more, right? Instead of producing at Q0, I'm going to produce at S1. But if you're a domestic consumer, you're like, oh no, this just got more expensive, right? So instead of consuming, instead of buying at Q0, you're buying down here at D1. And this gap has opened up. And this gap is how much this country is now exporting, right? So the producers are producing S1, and the domestic consumers are purchasing D1, and this whole difference here, S1 minus D1, that's going to be the amount that this country is exporting, right? So when this world price is up above the domestic equilibrium price, we're going to be exporting. And when this world is down below the equilibrium price and you open up to free trade, you're going to be importing. And that's usually the scenario. That importing scenario is usually where we start to see trade protection, right? Because trade protection comes around for a couple of reasons, but the primary reason we see tariffs and quotas and subsidies is this desire to protect industries that can't compete globally, right? We talked about how costly it can be to churn, right? When you specialize and you move a whole bunch of land, labor, and capital into the industries where you have comparative advantage, you're moving it out of industries you don't have comparative advantage. And those are people losing their livelihoods. And often governments are like, wait, we don't want to lose that sector entirely. So they step in to protect it. So usually where we're going to see trade protection is actually in a world like this, where the world price is below the domestic equilibrium price, right? And in that world, what you're going to see is in the absence of any trade barrier, right, you're going to be consumers love this lower price and they purchase more than they used to. So instead of buying Q0, domestic consumers are buying out at D1, right? And so free trade is great for consumers, right? You can think about this when the US opens up to free trade in the textile industry, like in things like t-shirts and clothes, right? Clothes get really cheap for consumers. It's awesome for consumers, but if you're a domestic producer, really not so good, right? If you were a domestic t-shirt manufacturer, right? Now, your price, instead of being at P0, is down here at the world price, right? And so the quantity you're producing goes from Q0 to S1. That's a whole bunch of factories closing. That's a whole bunch of people losing their jobs, right? So that's a lot of dislocation. Okay, so what do governments do about this? They say, oh my goodness, I don't like that this domestic supply just dropped from Q0 to S1, right? That's a drop in GDP. That's a loss of jobs. Like, that's not good. Sure, I like this part over here where consumers are getting to buy stuff cheaper. That means real incomes are going up. That's super nice. But I don't like this drop. I'm going to step in and I'm going to try to protect this industry. And we've talked about the three tools, the three primary tools: the tariffs, the quotas, the subsidies. And we're going to walk through how those work in these supply and demand graphs. Right? So let's start with the tariff, kind of the simplest and it's the most common. And I'm just going to flag for you that one of the reasons it's the most common, right, as we talked about, is that it puts money into the government's pocket. And so, the prefacing of all of this is saying that usually trade protection is something governments do to protect these domestic industries that are going to be displaced by economic openness, by globalization. But there's also this reason that governments will use tariffs, which is simply because it's a tax handle, because it's a way to grab revenue. Having an income tax is actually really hard. You have to know how much every citizen in your country makes. And that's a lot of information to have. If you're a pretty low capacity government, you may not know that. But even if you're a pretty low capacity government, usually at least you control your borders. And the great thing about a tariff is it's just a tax on every unit of a good that comes across the border. And so even if all your government is sort of like a militia that runs some checkpoints at the border, every time a truck comes through the checkpoint, you can take 10% of what's on the truck. And that can be your revenue stream. That's a tariff. That's tariffs as a revenue stream. And so you will see sort of tariffs show up in two places. Countries trying to protect a particular domestic industry and countries that are just desperate for revenue of some kind, right? So I'll sort of flag that sort of desperate for revenue of some kind as one reason you see tariffs, but mostly we'll see it in this protection sense. And so this is, as I said, you'll usually see these in countries where the world price is low relative to the no trade equilibrium price, right? And what a tariff does is it's going to charge a tax on top of the price of every imported unit. So that anything that's imported, the consumer has to pay the world price plus the difference of the tariff. So it's really as simple, just like we're just vertically moving up this graph by the amount of the tariff. And sometimes the tariff gets charged as a percentage of the price of the item. Sometimes the tariff is calculated as like $2 per broom or something like this, right? But what you're going to do, it's the equivalent of like bumping the world price up in terms of how it affects the market. And so without any tariff in place, with total free, so if we had no trade at all, the price would be up here, and the quantity produced and the quantity sold would be somewhere in the middle. We open up to free trade, and suddenly we're producing all the way down here. We're barely producing anything, and we're consuming a whole lot, right? This opening up to free trade is great for consumers here. They get things so much cheaper. Now we step in, we intervene, we charge a tariff, and the price bumps back up to here. And so what we're doing is when that price is bumped up, this is good for domestic producers, right? Instead of producing at S1, they're producing at S2. So that's a whole lot of people getting their jobs back, right? We're saving a lot of this industry. We're not saving the entire industry that we would have had in the absence of free trade, right? We haven't bumped it. We didn't charge such a high tariff that we got up all the way back up to this no trade equilibrium, but we got partway there, right? So we added a whole bunch to the domestic supply. But we imposed some significant costs on consumers. Right now, consumers have to pay this higher price. And because of it, they're going to consume less. So you've lost some of your consumer surplus, right? Consumers are now having to pay more for this. They lose out. But now we're importing a lot less than we used to. We used to import C1 minus S1. Now we only import C2 minus S2. We import many fewer units here. So this is what tariffs do. They're raising revenue for the government, they're increasing domestic production, and they're limiting how many units of this thing that we import. So that's a tariff in operation. How do these tariffs look in practice? These are, this again, it's a little bit dated. I pulled it out of a textbook, but these are sort of line item tariffs. And so this is why like trade agreements can go just pages and pages and pages, and the negotiations go on for weeks over each of these things. So an ad valorem tariff is a percentage of the price. So like bicycles at this time were taxed at 5.5% of their value. Wool blankets, it was 1.8 cents per kilogram that the blanket weighs, plus 6% of the price of the blanket. Like it gets super precise here, and it's a little bit, so tariff policy, right? It's very down at the line item, very narrow categories. Okay, so that's tariffs. Now let's move on to subsidies, right? So it's kind of the opposite of a tariff. If a tariff is this tax and a subsidy is a payment. So tariffs are great because they make money for the government. Subsidies are a little bit rough because they cost the government money, right? So the government has to tax somewhere else in order to be able to afford a subsidy. All right, so when the government is paying a subsidy here, we're looking at a world where the world price is already above the domestic no trade price. So we're already in a world where this country exports this particular item. So this is already an industry where the country in question is pretty globally competitive, right? They're exporting 4 million bushels of wheat every year, right? So at the world price, so with no trade, they'd be producing 6 million bushels and consuming 6 million bushels domestically. But up at the world price, they're only consuming 4 million bushels, right? Wheat got more expensive, so their domestic consumers have shifted over to rice and corn and some other things probably. But they're exporting, at this higher price, they're willing to produce quite a bit more, all the way up at 8 million bushels. And so they're exporting the difference, right? They're exporting 4 million bushels a year. But let's say the government, you've got some senators from some farm states, they really want to grow the rural economy. So like, no, let's really export a ton of wheat. Let's really grow this sector. So let's subsidize this sector. Let's, for every bushel of wheat that our domestic producers grow and sell, let's give them an extra $1 a bushel or something like that. What do we have here? Yeah, we're looking at an extra $1 a bushel, from $5 a bushel up to $6 a bushel. We'll give them that extra buck, right? So with that extra $1, what you're going to get is you're going to get the domestic suppliers producing all the way up here at 10 million bushels. Now, the nice thing is the domestic consumers, they don't have to pay anything extra here. They're still going to consume at the world price. And so domestically, we're still going to consume 4 million bushels, but we'll be exporting 6 million now. We'll be producing an extra couple million bushels, so we'll be exporting more, right? So we're moving along this supply curve out here, right? We don't move along the demand curve here because that subsidy isn't paid by the consumer, right? It's paid directly by the government. So the taxpayers have to pay it, which is, taxpayers and consumers overlap a lot, but they're slightly different people. Okay, so this is how subsidies work. We're boosting that domestic supply without harming the domestic consumer. The people we're harming is the domestic taxpayer, and the other people who are getting harmed are the foreign producers who are now getting outcompeted by this extra production from the country in question. Okay. Third sort of tool here. We've done tariffs, we've done subsidies, now let's do quotas. So quotas are relatively parallel to a tariff, except instead of charging a tax, a particular, saying, oh, you've got to pay an extra 10% to bring that in, we're saying, no, there's just a limit on how many of these you can bring in. You can only import, from Canada, we're only going to import 1,000 wool suits this year, or we're only going to import 100 million gallons of milk from Canada this year, right? So for a particular product, we're going to limit how much comes in a given year. So we're not going to charge anything extra. We're not going to collect any revenue from the government. We're just limiting imports. So what you can think about is we're limiting the distance between domestic supply and domestic demand here, right? So the price that's paid domestically is going to settle in at a place where we've limited this gap, right? So that's how this quota is going to work. So if we say that we can only that our quota for imports is this distance between Q3 and Q2, right? By limiting it to that width, right? That's going to push the domestic price up from P world to P quota, right? So nobody's collecting any revenue here, but if that's all we can import, right, then that tells us what our supply is going to be. The way to kind of think about it is that the quota that we can import is kind of augmenting our domestic supply. Right, so it's like we're bumping that supply curve out by the exact amount of the quota. Right, so that's how these quotas work. They're a little bit nicer for foreign producers than tariffs are. Right, so in the case of the tariff, and we'll talk a little bit more in our discussion about the difference between what we call the statutory incidence of a tariff and the economic incidence of a tariff. So the statutory incidence of a tariff or a tax is who is required by law to pay it. And with a tariff, that's usually the firm that's importing it, the company that's importing it. So the buyer has to pay it. But the economic incidence is like who gets harmed, right? Who actually has to kind of cover the cost. And with the tariff, that foreign producer is going to end up shouldering a fair amount of that cost. The producer surplus for the foreign producer is going to go down. With the quota, that foreign producer still is reaping the entire sale price. Because remember, that sale price with the tariff has to cover the cost of the tariff, and then there's some to go to the original producer. But with the quota, there's no, all of that can go to the original producer. So it's nicer for the foreign producers. So that's why you'll see quotas sometimes show up in a trade negotiation, because it's a little bit better for the foreign producer. So it's a little bit easier to protect your domestic industry with a quota than with a tariff in terms of what you can get the other side to agree to. But they're not as nice for the country that's implementing them, because unlike tariffs where the government gets revenue, with a quota they don't get revenue. But at the end of the day, the effect is the same, because you're going to raise the price paid by consumers. So it's going to hurt consumers. And you're going to increase the price received by a domestic producer. So it's great for domestic producers. You're going to increase the price they're receiving. You're going to increase the amount they produce. So that's people getting their jobs back, right? So quotas, just like tariffs, just like subsidies, are increasing that domestic production, right? That's people keeping their jobs, reducing that trade dislocation and that churn that we talked about being so painful. So that's it. These are the three mechanisms. I've got a couple of examples of quotas, just like I did with tariffs. So these are really specific, down to blue mold cheese from Argentina versus blue mold cheese from Chile, right? So really narrow and tight kind of line item quotas that make their way into trade agreements. So this is how the trade world works. So we'll talk about over the next couple of classes kind of winners and losers and political power and kind of how this all shakes out. But this material is really the nuts and bolts of how these things work. We'll work through these kind of lines on a graph in our homework assignment. So go through this in section and come into class on Thursday with questions for me about this, and we'll work through it in our lecture time as well. So thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you in person, see you via Zoom quite soon.